The marble you see in Rome today is a lie. You've seen the postcards, the Colosseum standing proud under a golden sun, the statues of stoic emperors staring into eternity. We've been told Rome was a sprawling metropolis of white stone and eternal glory. But if you stood in the center of the Roman Forum in the year 1000 AD, you wouldn't see an empire, you'd see a graveyard. The silence is suffocating. The grand palaces, they aren't homes anymore. They are stone quarries. The great arches, they're being used as cowsheds. How does a city of 1 million people, the New York of the ancient world, shrivel up until only 20,000 souls are left screaming in the dark? This isn't the history they taught you in school. This is the story of the ghost city. But to understand how Rome died, you need to see how it lived. Imagine the terror of the quiet decay. But to understand how Rome died, you need to see how it lived. In 100 AD, Rome was a heartbeat. 1.2 million people, aqueducts pumping fresh water like veins. Then the pulse stopped. But here's the part nobody tells you. First, the grain ships from Egypt stopped coming. Hunger wasn't a tragedy, it was the new neighbor. Then the Goths arrived. They didn't just burn buildings, they cut the aqueducts. Imagine 1 million people in a stone heat trap with no water. The baths turned into stagnant swamps, the fountains went dry. And then someone found the off switch. The people didn't all die in a massive war, they just walked away. Or did they? If the people left, then who were the shadow dwellers found hiding in the ruins of the theater of Pompeii? By the year 1000, Rome was a disarticulated skeleton. The survivors didn't live in houses, they lived inside the ruins like parasites. They built wooden shacks inside the marble shells of temples. The Forum Romanum, it was renamed Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture.
Think about that. Look at your own city. The malls, the highways, the towers. If the water stopped tomorrow, how long would it take for your neighborhood to become a forest? Tell me in the comments, what's the one thing in your city that would survive 1,000 years of silence? But the true horror wasn't the decay, it was the harvesting. The medieval Romans didn't respect their ancestors. They were desperate. They needed lime to build their tiny, ugly huts, so they took the priceless statues of Augustus and Romulus and they threw them into giant ovens. They burned history to make glue. Wait, it gets crazier. While the city was a ruin, the popes were still there. A handful of priests living in a fortress surrounded by miles of empty, haunted wasteland. They weren't ruling an empire, they were presiding over a funeral that lasted 5 centuries. The Rome you see today is a mask. It's a beautiful reconstruction built over the bones of a tragedy. We love to think of human progress as a straight line going up, but Rome is the proof that we can slide backward into the dirt. We can forget how to build, how to read, and how to survive. Most people look at the past and see glory. We look closer and see the truth. If you want to keep unearthing the stories they tried to bury, join this journey. Hit that subscribe button. Don't let the history go cold. The most haunting part, when the Renaissance finally rediscovered Rome, they found that the ground level had risen by 20 feet. The ruined city wasn't gone. It was buried under 500 years of trash, dirt, and forgotten lives.
We aren't walking on Roman streets today. We're walking on their ceiling. The question is, what are we building today that will be someone else's floor in 1,000 years? Most people think Rome fell in a day. One big explosion, one final battle, and poof, the lights went out in 476 AD. That's a lie. The fall wasn't a crash. It was a century-long car wreck in slow motion. Imagine the 400s. The Vandals didn't just walk in. They stripped the city like vultures. They took the gold off the roof of the Temple of Jupiter. They didn't just steal the treasures, they stole the pride. But the real nightmare? The Gothic Wars. Imagine a city being besieged, liberated, and then besieged again, 5 times in 20 years. Rome became a tennis ball in a game played by giants. Each time a new army broke through the walls, more shops closed, more libraries burned,
More families simply stopped existing. But even without the gold, even without the emperor, Rome could have survived. It had one thing no other city had: a miracle of engineering that kept 1 million people alive. And then the Goths found the off switch. Rome didn't run on money, it ran on water. 11 massive aqueducts, stone arteries stretching miles into the mountains, pumped 300 million gallons of fresh water into the city every single day. It was the lifeblood of the empire. In 537 AD, the Gothic king Vitiges did the unthinkable. He didn't just attack the walls, he smashed the aqueducts. Think about the sound of that. Millions of gallons of water suddenly pouring out into the dirt, miles away from the city. Inside Rome, the fountains didn't just stop, they gasped. The great thermal baths, the social heart of the city, turned into cold, damp tombs. Within days, the hills of Rome, the famous 7 hills where the elites lived, became uninhabitable. You can't live on a hill without a bucket, and there was no one left to carry them. Imagine the desperation. Thousands of people, once citizens of the world's most advanced civilization, now scavenging like animals. They abandoned their marble villas on the heights and descended into the lowlands, the campus marshes. Why? Because that's where the Tiber River was. The Tiber wasn't clean. It was a muddy, sewage-filled drain, but it was the only water left. The Roman people went from living in the city of gods to living in mud brick shacks on a riverbank, praying the next flood wouldn't wash their children away. Think about your own life. If the water in your taps stopped tomorrow, how far would you walk for a single gallon? Would you leave your home? Would you fight your neighbor? Drop a drop in the comments if you think modern cities are just as fragile as Rome was. With the hills empty and the water gone, something eerie happened. The silence wasn't empty. The wolves returned. Nature began to reclaim the eternal city. By the year 600, there were literal forests growing inside the city walls. But while the city was rotting, something or someone was hiding in the basement of the Vatican. A secret power was rising from the rubble, and it wasn't interested in rebuilding the empire. It wanted something much more valuable: your soul. By the year 700, Rome wasn't a city anymore. It was a disabitato, the uninhabited. Imagine a mother in Rome, 537 AD. Her child is crying, not from war, from thirst. Yesterday, water flowed into her home. Today, she walks miles to a dirty river. And tomorrow, she doesn't know if her child survives. Imagine walking through the massive Aurelian walls, expecting a bustling capital, and finding a jungle. Thousands of acres of prime real estate were now just swamps and thickets. The 7 hills, where emperors once hosted banquets that cost millions, were now silent, haunted by wolves and bandits. The people who stayed didn't live on the streets. They hid under the shadows. They lived in pockets of life, isolated from each other by miles of vine-choked ruins. If you screamed for help in the center of Rome, the only thing that would answer was an echo. But it gets weirder. The Romans didn't just let the ruins sit there. They treated the greatest monuments of human history like a hardware store. The Roman Forum. This was the beating heart of the world. This is where Julius Caesar walked, where Mark Antony gave his speeches, where the laws of Western civilization were written in stone. Fast forward to the medieval Dark Ages, it had a new name: Campo Vaccino, the cow pasture. The dirt had piled up so high, layers of flood silt and uncollected trash, that the tops of the massive triumphal arches were barely sticking out of the ground. Peasants tied their cattle to the Corinthian columns. Pigs rooted for food where the Senate once debated the fate of nations. Imagine the psychological shock. You're a farmer and you're eating your lunch on a piece of carved marble that's worth more than your entire village. You have no idea who built it. To you, it's just a weirdly shaped rock. This is the part that hurts. This is spolia. Rome wasn't destroyed by outsiders. It was eaten by its own children. The medieval Romans didn't have the tools to cut new stone, so they mined their own past. Need a new house? Just go to the Colosseum and pry out some iron clamps. Need a wall for your pigsty? Go to the Temple of Venus and rip down a slab of marble.
But the worst was the lime kilns. They took the most beautiful, intricate statues of the gods, masterpieces that would be priceless in a museum today, and threw them into giant ovens. They burned the marble to turn it into lime for cheap cement. They literally turned the faces of the emperors into the glue for their mud huts. This is like using a MacBook as a cutting board for onions. If you were living in a ruin today, would you preserve the history, or would you destroy it just to survive the winter? Type survive or preserve in the comments. I want to see how many of you would have been the ones burning the statues. But while the peasants were mining the stone, someone else was mining the fear. Deep in the tunnels of the city, under the Colosseum, under the baths, a new world was forming. People started whispering about the giants who built the city, convinced that the ruins were too grand to be made by humans. They thought the city was cursed, and they were right to be afraid, because while the sun was shining on the cows in the Forum, something was happening in the catacombs that would change the world forever. The dead were about to become more powerful than the living. Imagine walking into the Colosseum today. You see a monument, but in the year 1000, you'd see a fortified slum. The arches weren't empty. They were plugged with mud, bricks, and human filth. The massive arena where gladiators once bled for glory, it was a condominium. People built houses inside the seating tiers. They had shops in the vomitoria. They had stables in the basement where the lions used to howl. The Theater of Marcellus, it wasn't a place for plays anymore. It was a literal castle. The rich didn't build new palaces. They just moved into the giant stone skeletons of the past because they were too thick to be knocked down by an invading army. But don't mistake this for a peaceful community. These weren't neighborhoods. They were war zones.
Rome was no longer a city of laws. It was a city of clans. Think of them like the mafia, but with plate armor. The Crescanti and the Tuscolani. These families didn't live in the streets. They lived in the ruins. They fought over every pile of marble. One family would fortify a bridge, another would fortify a tomb. The Mausoleum of Hadrian, it became a fortress. The Arch of Titus, it was built into a wall for a private gang. If you wanted to cross from one side of the city to the other, you didn't just walk. You paid a tax to a thug sitting in a 1,000-year-old temple. Wait, it gets crazier. These families were so powerful, they didn't just control the streets, they kidnapped the popes. They turned the Vatican into their personal playground. Rome wasn't the capital of a religion, it was a hostage held by warlords. What was life like for the average person in this dead capital? Luxury? Gone. Education? Dead. The economy wasn't based on gold, it was an economy of scraps. If you wanted a plate, you dug it up from a Roman trash heap. If you wanted to eat, you didn't go to a market, you went to the Tiber. The river was a graveyard, but it was the only source of life. People lived on a diet of muddy fish and whatever small crops they could grow in the dead zones between the ruins. There were no doctors, only relics. If you got sick, you didn't get medicine, you touched a piece of bone from a saint and prayed. The greatest empire on earth had been reduced to people eating porridge in the shadows of giants. Imagine living in a world where you're surrounded by skyscrapers, but no one knows how to fix the elevator or the lights. You're just a scavenger in a high-tech cave. Does that sound like a nightmare or a fresh start? Comment Dark Age if you think we're closer to this than we realize. For 500 years, Rome was a corpse being picked clean. But then, something shifted. A light flickered in the dark. It started with a single discovery. A statue found buried deep in the mud of a vineyard. It wasn't broken, it was beautiful. When the people looked at that statue, they didn't see a pagan devil. For the first time in half a millennium, they saw themselves. The Renaissance was coming, but it wasn't a birth, it was an exhumation. The emperor was gone, the legions were dust. So why didn't Rome just dissolve into the earth? Because of a ghost hierarchy. When the world turned dark, the Pope stepped into the vacuum. He didn't have an army, but he had something better, heaven. Rome was no longer the capital of a territory, it was the capital of a faith. Imagine a map of Europe in the year 900. Every road, every trail, every muddy path led to one place, not for trade, not for politics, but for salvation. The city was a ruin, yes, but it was a holy ruin.
The economy was dead, but a new one took its place, the pilgrim industry. Thousands of people traveled months across dangerous forests and mountain passes just to touch a piece of stone in a Roman basement. They didn't bring grain, they brought silver. Rome was surviving on the oxygen of prayer. While the clans were fighting in the streets, there was a secret war happening in the cloisters. Inside the cold, damp walls of monasteries, monks were hunched over desks. They weren't just praying, they were knowledge smugglers. They were desperately copying ancient scrolls, Euclid, Aristotle, the Bible, before the ink faded or the parchment rotted. If these monks hadn't spent 500 years in the dark, copying words they sometimes didn't even understand, your entire modern world wouldn't exist. Science, philosophy, law, it was all hanging by a thread in a ruined city.
By the year 1300, something shifted. The ghosts started to stir. People stopped looking at the ruins with fear. They started looking at them with guilt. They realized that 1,000 years ago, their ancestors were smarter, stronger, and more creative than they were. This was the seed of the Renaissance. It wasn't a new birth, it was an exhumation. Rome never died, it was just a sleeping giant. The collapse was necessary. Without the silence of the silent Rome, the world would never have felt the hunger to rediscover the light. But here is the most haunting lesson Rome leaves for us today. We always imagine the end of the world as a massive explosion, a nuclear flash, a meteor. Rome tells us a different story. Civilizations don't always go out with a bang. Sometimes they just contract. They get smaller, they get quieter. People stop caring about the big picture and start caring about where their next bucket of water is coming from. Look at the world right now. Are we building things that will last 2,000 years, or are we just building spolia for the next generation to burn for warmth? If you stayed until this final second, type eternal in the comments. It lets me know who truly respects the weight of history. The next time you see a picture of the Colosseum, don't just see the marble, see the cow pasture, see the mud huts, see the people who refused to let the flame go out. Rome didn't survive because of its stones, it survived because of its soul. If you want to go deeper into the mysteries that define our world, don't just watch, join this journey. Hit subscribe. Don't let the algorithm decide what you remember.
Now, look around you. We live in an age of glass towers and digital clouds. We think we've conquered the collapse, but Rome thought that too. They had central heating, high-speed roads, and a global economy, and yet the forest still found its way into their bedrooms. Ask yourself, if the power grid blinked out for a year, just 1 year, how long before your local mall becomes a Campo Vaccino? How long before the skyscrapers in your city are just mining sites for the people living in the mud below? History isn't a straight line, it's a circle, and right now, we are at the top. Do you think our modern world is too big to fail, or are we just one broken aqueduct away from the next dark age? Type fragile or forever in the comments. I read every single one. Most people will scroll past this and forget the lessons of the silent Rome, but not you. You stayed until the end because you know that the truth is buried under the surface. If you want to keep unearthing the stories they tried to bury, the hidden histories that prove how fragile our world really is, then join this journey. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't let the algorithm decide what you remember. In a world of noise, stay focused